Hearts of Iron is a challenging game to discuss in terms of historicity without running into some difficult questions. Similarly, Sovietology is a challenging subfield of history to discuss without running into some difficult questions. I thought I'd pair the two, seeing as the Sovietologists have been on my radar for a while and unpacking Hearts of Iron has been the missing game in my roster. This time, we're going to be looking at how the game presents the Soviet Union while exploring a select few focuses and elements of depiction and how they line up, for better or worse, with the history work of the Sovietologists. How the game mirrors and diverges from accounts by Western, generally Anglophone scholars of the Soviet Union who endeavored to unravel what they perceived as the mysterious enemy. To cut this off right at the start, as with most games about diverging history, the historicity is front-loaded. We need to look at how the game portrays its start point and where it seems to display intended paths if we want to get at the history that's core to this historical simulation. Speaking candidly, I might have been able to talk about all this without even buying the DLC by just looking at a JPEG of the focus tree. And I could have probably done without reading a bunch of real Soviet military theory and doing all three of the communists paths to completion, but I had to be sure I wasn't missing something. It would be salient to start with a brief overview of the state of Soviet history and the nature of Sovietology, as well as one of the Soviet Union in Hearts of Iron. Soviet history is what else but the history of the Soviet Union. Many subfields of history have debates that rage within them, none more famous among contemporary historians than that of the Historischer Streit of German history. Soviet history's own debate tends to center on how absolute the government's control was, but the unique conditions of the Soviet Union as a repressive autocratic regime and the Iron Curtain led to the rise of a select group of historians and journalists writing history dubbed the Sovietologists. As we'll get into today, the standout elements of the Sovietologists hinge on their methods, intent, and often political biases. As for the state of the Soviet Union in-game, 1936 is the first year of the Great Purge, which lasts until 1938, though in reality, elements of the Purge had been initiated as early as 1924, 12 years earlier when Stalin took the reins of the Soviet Union. It's somewhat a matter of perspective, but keep that in mind for later. As the Soviet Union, the player must navigate balancing the purge and preparing for the inevitable conflict that the game centers on. To my memory, in iterations prior to No Step Back, this largely consisted of waiting to clear some debuffs with a single focus. Following the expansion, it's a fleshed out experience of fear, dread, paranoia, and misdirection. If you can't tell, I think they pulled it off well. Contrary to how other Paradox titles have often abandoned the playability of later start dates as patches and expansions came out, No Step Back has updated the 1939 start, and it gives us a bit of a window into the admittedly predictable trajectory expected of a historical run, in that it's, well, historical with minimal controversy. The purge is divided into three paths if staying communist. The three red choices are the left, right, and center, coordinating, respectively, a Bukharinist or Trotskyist civil war or staying the course with Stalin. Historical gameplay puts one in the center position, as Stalin, or not literally as Stalin, but navigating history from the Stalin side. The other sides only have a passing value in discussion. If you came here hoping for me to pick apart the historical possibility of the Romanov tree or to debate the position of the rightists on the political compass, sorry. This portrayal of the purge is challenging to disentangle because while it's not the same as Great Man history, it clearly deviates from the distance the game tends to give us from the historical chess pieces we're moving around when we select our foci. The Stalin route talks about the purges and apprehension and conspiracy as though they're all correct. Not as an act of revisionism, but as a setting of tone, of inhabiting Stalin's role. This inadvertently dips into Sovietology, which has two principal manifestations: understanding Soviet history as a product of individuals and their psychologies, as the Stalin did X and Y route, or the other route of being distanced and statistically inclined. Note here that I will be going into some relatively small elements of the game, but I think this topic, even more so than previous videos, demonstrates the disproportionate impact that small choices can have on the historical lens of the game, or indeed how a game's mechanics implicitly play into certain tellings of history. We're going to be focusing on 2.5 specific things: Stalin's role and mass assault, with a side of collectivization. Realistically, the likelihood of a left or right resurgence following 1928, let alone as late as 1936, are embellished by the tree for gameplay, and I won't fault the game for that liberty, just noting it here. The practical reality in-game of a Trotskyite or Bukharinist plot is framed rightly as irrelevant. On the Stalin route, it's not the possibility of a coup that motivates the player, it's navigating the consequences of Stalin. What's interesting in terms of historical framing is that the paranoia mechanic delves into Stalin's personal psychology. No Step Back introduced a particular mechanic around the purges, political paranoia. While it's absolutely true that a generalized air of paranoia can settle upon a people, a society, and indeed that's the case with the Stalin era itself, the wording here and the way the foci speak of known unknowns, of threats just outside of view, shifts the paranoia to a more personal tone, and the point of view shifts with it to that of the leader, of Stalin himself. This is, as I stated earlier, a departure from the usual model of the game. The Tree for Britain doesn't have a route where one dispenses tedious quips as Churchill, and they absolutely weren't going to make something comparable for this guy. Mind you, this isn't me pointing out some apparent flaw, just a moment of distinction that plays into, or indeed may be a product of iffy historical practices. I think they've built an interesting system here. It adds flavor to the country, seeks to demonstrate the history in a distinct way, and works cohesively as a game mechanic itself, even if it's frustrating and tense. I bring it up because the framing it requires is dissonant from the rest of the game. The general setup, the framework of Hearts of Iron, is a distanced one, which it has to be, given that the focus trajectories see us reshaping or outright replacing starting governments. The player is not the state, exactly. That's how there can even be a Romanov tree in the first place. Nor are we the country's leader, as in the individual person, for much the same reason. Stalin wouldn't elect to empower those plotting against him. And more importantly, if we plot against him, he starts making moves against us that mirror the historical route. If nothing else, that's certainly an innovative solution to the question of Stalin's presence as an independent force and a threat to your choices. While the Purge foci don't ever switch to first-person language and don't speak with uncertainty, they have a perspective and unearned certainty to them that puts the player more in the place of Stalin. Though not fully, because that paranoia becomes somewhat of a thing to be managed. Stalin is both our perspective and an obstacle. His paranoia is an unshakable mechanic. When you oppose him, he has agency. When you are him, you inhabit the paranoia. And when you're on the center path, you do some bad things that the game doesn't really comment on. Or in so much as you do anything in Hearts of Iron, what you do is you select the focus that makes Stalin start the Moscow trials. There's levels of abstraction. Speaking of bad things the game doesn't really want to comment on or want the player to feel responsible for, this is where I'm going to introduce a subject of certain contention. The famines. Don't worry or hold your breath, I'm not about to come out as some tanky famine denialist. The contention among historians is not whether they happened or didn't, it's a matter of scope, depth, and intent. The failures of collectivization, a description that itself changes from a literal to euphemistic phrasing depending on one's position, is a center point of Sovietology. I'm also going to, for this video, continue to use the terms of the game in failures of collectivization or refer to it as the famine. I'm just not chancing it with the site, and while I know the language used to talk about an event implies a stance, I am choosing my words expressly with the algorithm in mind. Aside from when we talk later about the Sovietologist position, and even then only lightly, we'll be tabling the famine for now, but it's with good reason. One is that the game doesn't really speak on it, and how could they? Imagine if they were like, "Hi player, welcome to playing this fun new expansion of the game, here's the faction you're playing. By the way, they may have just committed some crimes against humanity, if not absolutely gone through a famine that at the very least disproportionately harmed a specific people." The game's position, in so much as there even is one, is summed up in one focus that implies the failure of prior collectivization efforts. With that caveat to death, we're ready to jump into a different abstracted faceless casualty debate with mass assault. This is going to sound like pedantry, or worse, nerdy war history, but let's talk for a bit about the assignment of doctrines to countries. Now, to start off, in terms of players and gameplay, there's a general consensus that mass assault is, ironically, not very useful for the countries that start with it. that they have plenty of manpower as is and are served better with other doctrines. I'm not here to add on to that debate, but it raises the questions of why they start with these doctrines and what the doctrines represent. On the surface, it's easy enough to connect. Large population countries make use of their large populations. I would argue that despite arguably being tailored to be the Soviet doctrine in a similar fashion to how mobile warfare uses German in its names, the mass assault doctrine is a poor representation of actual Soviet practice and relies on some iffy historical claims and even negative propaganda. Now, there's something of a challenge to reading the intent of these trees. One is that the two mutually exclusive forks both draw from real history, not just hypothetical paths. America, for example, uses both sides of the superior firepower fork in real life. And of course, in the real world, militaries don't have mutually exclusive skill trees, I think. The issue is that the human wave elements of the canonically Soviet tree weren't some formal doctrine, they were, generally, desperate measures, or going further, they were the absence of tactics, the choice of individual commanders who made bad decisions, or a misunderstanding or indeed falsification of events by the opposing side. Beyond that, history maps poorly onto the game. Tukhachevsky's deep battle, more often called deep organization, was a product of the experience of the Russian Civil War and Polish invasion. By definition, it is and always was a combined arms effort. The wording of mass assault is conflicted. The trees are modeled on the tactics and trajectory of the real world war prescriptively. The start of the Soviet mass assault deep battle tree is at odds with its ends. The first portion leans human wave as doctrine. The tree itself steps back from the established combined arms approach that the Soviet Union had as early as 1936 into a making do and desperation position. In reality, the Soviets abandoned deep org because it was associated with purged military theorists and, as the case was, the practice of warfare, the organization of the army itself, was ideologically understood as a praxis of revolution. As such, they abandoned deep org for years, which the game can't exactly emulate. In order to not require some mechanic of starting out all doctrined out and losing your deep org doctrines when the purge happens like the beginning of a Metroidvania, the game instead sets the first segments pre-deep battle to be defensive. In reality, deep battle and general Soviet military theory was centered on offense, and that's important because it's partly why they were so unprepared for the German offensive. The tree ends up a reflection of the historical trajectory of the Soviet Union, tweaked for gameplay functionality. While ultimately these trees play loose with theory, the inclusion of human wave is egregious. What makes this relevant for our purpose is the popular perception of the Soviet war effort and the way it leans into dehumanization. Human wave and horde depictions go hand in hand. The use of human wave as a derogatory descriptor intended to dehumanize/barbarize a people was not uncommon to the Cold War when speaking on Soviet World War II battles and the Chinese in the Korean War. For an unorthodox explanation of this, let's look at Wikipedia, but not the article itself, at the talk page. Also, forgive that Wikipedia is a source here, but in this case, it's a primary one. We're looking at the historical attitude and perception of an event, not the events themselves. And so it is that there's a discussion going as far back as 2009 on the nature of human wave. Of significant note to me is that the article has always been contentious, and one particular contention was about the application of the term. That human wave was originally described as post-World War I is astonishing. What differentiates the Somme, a British infantry charge with such substantial losses to later be colloquially known as the Great Fuck-Up, from that of human wave? Especially when bearing in mind that, again, human wave is not an intended practice. The article itself is weak as articles go, but it's important to us for two reasons. One, it demonstrates the actual use of the term, given that it isn't a real theory, and even the implicit potential nature of it. And two, it does point to discussions of media use and the value of the term itself. Now, admittedly, this is a term that could be rehabilitated and neutralized, but the tendency for it to be used exclusively when talking about countries that are granted a negative image, particularly by highlighting how they don't care about their people or are seen as disposable and all that, it falls into a poor spot, both as a term and in the game. This is not a condemnation of Hoy or Paradox so much as one facet of how the game takes on a Sovietological nature, and admittedly it's a bit indirect. It feeds into an established popular narrative that is itself biased. I'm not going to conflate that bias with literal Nazi propaganda, but there's a shared streak of dehumanization going on there. And now that I've clumsily tarnished your view by associating the work of the Sovietologists with propaganda, we should probably dig into the Sovietologists, or dig them out of that hole. First off, it's prudent to describe what Sovietology is and draw some distinctions. The temptation might be to think it's just a quirky way of describing Soviet history, or distinguishing Western historians of the Soviet Union from Soviet historians of the Soviet Union, and that's partially the intent. It is wordy to say American Soviet historians, but the distinction is relevant, and saying just Soviet historians, as with many nationalities, has a context-sensitive meaning. Some distinction must be made between historians, political scientists, and journalists here. The latter two groups had their own brand of Sovietology, which tended towards conjecture based on things like perceived hand gestures and who sat next to who, really scrounging for crumbs to analyze from beyond the Iron Curtain. By nature, they were looking at contemporary sources, if you can call them that, where historians were looking, as they do, to the past. That said, the historians are not absolved from having their own problems like bias and othering. Sovietology is more akin to Egyptology, if you follow. Where Egyptology looks at a dead, unknowable culture, Sovietology expects and is built upon a presumption of distance, where communication isn't possible. The way the Soviet Union is approached, by virtue of lacking the ideal set of sources, is with language that suggests a certain otherness to the culture. Note that this otherness, a near-Orientalization, predates the Soviet Union, both in practice and in historical lens. Western academics of the present often treat Russia as some inherently foreign and mysterious space, unknowable in customs. When Genghis Khan sang Moskau, fremd und geheimnisvoll, they weren't pulling their perception from nowhere. It also got them permanently banned from the Soviet Union in 1980, which is supremely funny to me. Second, it's relevant to have a basic grasp of the changes in access to sources when assessing Soviet history. Initially, we, the outside world, have deeply limited access in the early Soviet era. The West isn't all that interested to begin with, though a few works come out, often more anthropological in nature. Following the Second World War, interest peaks right around the time of Stalin's death, but before de-Stalinization, and we're left with people speculating from the outside. Soon after, Khrushchev begins de-Stalinization, which leads to some archives opening up, but there are still stringent doctrinal rules and degrees of censorship. Then there's a sidestep in the 70s with what is essentially an illegal analog information market, known by the term samizdat, coupled with its partner, tamizdat, the publication of things abroad. Following that, we have glasnost in the 80s, which reinvigorates the subfield but pales in comparison to the changes in 91 following the regime collapse. That doesn't mean there weren't a ton of books written in the between years, but it does give us funny moments like people writing their whole new thesis on the nature and longevity of the Soviet Union, only for it to stop being a country before their paper sees peer review. Note this newfound access, the waves of sources, apply to non-Western and Soviet scholars as well, but we'll be sticking to the West by nature. The detail of who is doing the history work is very relevant to the subfield, not least because we're dealing with sources that aren't in English, and there are translation concerns, which could be an entire video topic, but also because of the aforementioned archival access and the value of lived experience when dealing with authoritarian regimes. In the preface to, okay, hold up, this may be the second time I've brought up a preface, and I have two things to say about that. One is that prefaces are actually very valuable windows into the shape of subfields, the spots where historians have usually done the most direct historiography for us, or indeed mention their resource limitations. I highly recommend that if you're the type to just skip over them, you break that habit if you're wishing you had some added context to a work. Just be mindful it's less often historical context as it is meta-textual context. Second thing, I sometimes worry that when I say, in the intro to this book, here in a video, people might think I didn't read it or something. Is that a common thing? Is it basically imposter syndrome? I don't know. Sorry if you, too, suffer from, but the first 16 pages hit hardest syndrome, or whatever it is. Okay, moving on. In the preface to Robert Conquest's The Great Terror, A Reassessment, Conquest gives us the metatextual context for his work. In doing so, he sets us up to understand the constraints that bore us, the Sovietologists. When speaking on the older edition of the 70s, he notes,
The Great Terror still had to rely to a large extent on émigré, defector, and other unofficial material. As with the writing of ancient history, it was a matter of balancing and assessing incomplete, partial, and uneven material, and not, as with the writing of modern Western history, the deployment in addition to these of adequate and credible official archives. I printed in The Great Terror a long bibliographical note in which I explained why and to what extent I accepted material published in the West.
He concludes the preface noting that he was happy to have, in his view, been proven right by the newer sources, by the extended knowledge. I'll note here that the wider field does not necessarily share his perspective on being proven right. We'll be seeing more of Conquest in a moment, but for now let's look to an overview of the subfield as provided by Sheila Fitzpatrick, who we looked at in the Victoria 3 video on the general nature of historiography. She describes the state of Western academia focused on the Soviets as, in the West, Soviet history became a matter of strong interest only after the Second World War, mainly in a Cold War context of knowing the enemy. The two books that set the tone were fiction, George Orwell's 1984 and Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. But in the scholarly realm, it was American political science that dominated. The totalitarian model, based on somewhat demonized conflation of Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia, was the most popular interpretative framework. It emphasized the omnipotence of the totalitarian state and its levels of control, paid considerable attention to ideology and propaganda, and largely neglected the social realm, which was seen as passive, fragmented by the totalitarian state. Surrounding that quote is the broader trajectory, with emphasis on the waves of archival opening as mentioned previously. The end point is to say that social history, along with interest in cultural and intellectual history, fully developed only following archival openings, the two events inextricably linked. Much of Sovietology adopts or indeed maintains the tone Fitzpatrick laid out, that of defining the enemy, of political science guiding the direction of discourse while itself having a different platform. I might even suggest that, were the social history style sources available, they might still have garnered little interest, given the fixation on understanding the Soviet life as utterly controlled, entirely dependent on the whims and actions of the totalitarian state. This establishes the two major factions of Soviet historiography, though neither go by the name Sovietologists. We have the totalitarian and revisionist schools. Unfortunately, both those terms have other meanings, but the quick rundown is that, as Fitzpatrick stated, the totalitarian school believed the nature of the Soviet state to be one of absolute control. The revisionists came later to challenge, and thus revise, that position. Historiography includes instances of not just review, but full-on dialogue between historians, if not through debate, then through publicly published letters in magazines and journals, sometimes over the span of months. One such dialogue is between two men, the aforementioned Robert Conquest and another historian named J.R. Getty, who represent, respectively, the totalitarian and revisionist sides of the subfield. The inciting incident is a review by Getty of Conquest's 1986 book, The Harvest of Sorrow. What follows is a public back and forth published in the London Review of Books across the span of half a year. I'm going to put a link to a collection of letters down below. I won't assign the homework of asking you to pause and read it all, but it's an interesting and lively exchange. Here's a fragment from Getty's initial review.
Robert Conquest, author of The Great Terror and many other works of the Soviet Union, provides an account of these events. He begins with an informative 4-chapter survey of the peasant problem and of Bolshevik attempts to solve it before 1928. Part 2, To Crush the Peasantry, takes the story to 1930 and deals with the campaigns to dispossess the kulaks, the well-to-do peasants whom Stalinists blamed for withholding grain, and to implement crash collectivization. Part 3, The Terror Famine, discusses the tragic 1932 famine in the Ukraine and offers a controversial thesis that the famine was intentionally organized and maintained by Stalin as a conscious act against the Ukrainian people.
The latter sentence is important and requires some delicate attention. The famine and intentionality serve as a center of debate among Soviet historians. That's how Conquest and Getty represent their sides. Not in debating if it happened, but in how, by what mechanisms, by whose orders, if there even were orders. The totalitarian model, in supposing total control, thus supposes intentionality, where the revisionist model is revising that perception of totality, and thus opens the door to possibilities ranging from partially blameless mismanagement to intentional redirection of resources by mid-level bureaucrats to even systematic inevitabilities. And it's here I want to make it terribly clear. The revisionists are not in the business of erasing history, of pretending there was no famine, no death. Getty says elsewhere in the letter that there were millions of victims. That doesn't stop the debate from being bogged down by accusations of political bias, but to be fair, Getty punches first.
Conquest's hypothesis, sources, and evidence are not new. Indeed, he himself first put forward his view 2 years ago in a work sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute. The intentional famine story, however, has been an article of faith for Ukrainian émigrés to the West since the Cold War. Much of Conquest's most graphic description is taken from such period pieces as The Golgotha of Ukraine, 1953, The Black Deeds of the Kremlin, 1953, and Communism, the Enemy of Mankind, 1955. Conquest's book will thus give a certain academic credibility to a theory which has not been generally accepted by nonpartisan scholars outside the circles of exiled nationalities. In today's conservative political climate with its evil empire discourse, I am sure that the book will be very popular.
You can see how quickly the concern here goes from the book to ideological underpinnings. For those who don't know, the American Enterprise Institute is a neoconservative think tank that, while never openly endorsing presidential candidates, has among its board and former members all the usual Iraq War enjoyers, and, inexplicably, convicted felon Dinesh D'Souza. Consider it a call-out for Getty to drop that link on us. Also note that while the question of political bias and its impact in creating artificially inflated victim counts does become a later concern, it's nowhere near stuff like the Black Book of Communism claiming Nazi soldiers in its victim count. Getty does not pull punches. He's very forward in his assertion that the interest in the famine is resurgent in America as a facet of the Cold War, that this is history being done for political gain.
Conquest does not conceal his political sympathies. For him, the main lesson seems to be that communist ideology provided the motivation for an unprecedented massacre of men, women, and children.
Following this section, Getty breaks down Conquest's arguments and assumptions while providing some counter-arguments. I won't be going into the arguments such as they are because it's a bit too in the weeds, interesting though it is, and is better saved for a future video. Read them yourself if you'd like to be ahead of the class for when that one comes out. Conquest responds to some of these assertions, starting with,
Sir, I have only just seen your review of my The Harvest of Sorrow by J. Arch Getty. Though it is largely self-refuting, there are a few assertions which an uninstructed reader might believe to be true. This aberration also occurs in his own book, which I reviewed not quite as badly as it deserved. Getty belongs to a gaggle of revisionists, who have achieved, like David Irving in another sphere, a certain notoriety. But I am wrong in comparing Getty to David Irving. Irving, though perverse and absurd in his conclusions, does not lack a certain ability to discover and present facts. Come to that, there are pro-Soviet, even pro-Stalin writers who are, at least in this sense, qualified scholars. Getty is not among them.
David Irving is a discredited former historian and Nazi apologist who attempted to mainstream denial? So that's quite the comparison, even in 1987. This debate, supposedly centered on a very serious subject, a discussion that shaped Soviet historiography for a decade and is frequently cited as such, is surprisingly catty? Here's Getty's reply.
Conquest's work belongs to the genre of the great 19th century idealist historians who used personal accounts and literary sources to write about heroes and anti-heroes, good and bad. These are tales of evil and omnipotent princes, innocent populations, and happy kingdoms ravaged by inhuman conquerors. This accessible and pleasant format makes for good reading, but it does not facilitate careful understanding. Using stories as if they were documents, it paints the big picture without worrying about how well the pieces fit. Finally, I am saddened and disappointed that Conquest has chosen to reduce a productive debate to the level of personal attack. He now gratuitously complains that he reviewed my book, quote, not quite as badly as it deserved, and writes that I am not a qualified scholar. It is, of course, easier to cry perversity than it is to explain and interpret new evidence. For many reasons, I regret that, in Conquest's eyes, my social science training and approach disqualify me from the field as he understands it. But after all, not everyone could be a poet.
Okay, brief aside. Robert Conquest worked for the Information Research Department, the IRD, a secret British government organization formed in 1948 to spread anti-communist and pro-colonialist propaganda. While working there, he had an assistant named Celia Kirwan, whom he once sent to ask George Orwell for a now infamous list of writers he suspected had Stalinist sympathies. The reason he sent Celia is that Orwell had once proposed to her. A bit odd to weaponize the romantic feelings of a man dying of tuberculosis in that way, especially since Robert Conquest himself, by all accounts, wrote several love poems to Celia and was himself infatuated and rejected, and went on to publish the poems anyway. But after all, not everyone can be a poet. Here's Conquest's response.
Getty asks if I think his training in social studies has had a bad effect. Yes. It, or something, has incapacitated him for the study of history, at any rate of Soviet history. Better sociologists than he have made fools of themselves by applying such methods to Stalin's Russia. They too were incapable of understanding the nature of evidence, historical or otherwise. The establishment of historical fact is not a simple and mechanical matter. All evidence is in one way or another imperfect, but truth may yet be derived from it by the exercise of judgment based on experience, and, in the Soviet case, by a background of knowledge of the nature of alien cultures. The skills of a historian are no doubt difficult to master, yet one should not try to write or criticize history until one has them.
The snarkier part of the feud ends with Getty's rebuttal, where he decides to take the high road.
The exchange between Robert Conquest and myself, which began as a controversy over the Ukrainian famine in the early 30s, has unfortunately gone beyond the interpretation of historical sources, and by now probably risks boring your readers.
From there on, he sticks to arguments and sources rather than potshots at credibility and qualification, though this letter is the final letter in the exchange, which spanned half a year. The exchange is both elucidating for our purpose today and a very funny aside. With the snark behind us, let's look at how this shook out. We have Conquest in the totalitarian approach versus Getty and the revisionist approach, and there's a constant tension of what I'd call misrepresentation. Routinely, Getty is tasked with rebutting not an argument, but an aspersion, of clarifying he does believe in the atrocity, that he's not a denialist like David Irving, that he's not a Stalinist positively comparing Stalin to Thomas Jefferson. In turn, Conquest has to routinely reaffirm an absence of bias and an air of qualification in the face of accusations that he is funded by think tanks with particular visions of the Cold War. We'll leave behind the direct quotes with one last bit from Getty's initial review.
Yet there are reasons why the majority of scholars have so far rejected the theory. First, we actually know very little about the scale of the famine. Using census calculations of excess mortality, Conquest arrives at a figure some 5 million victims of the Ukrainian famine. Yet, such respected economic and demographic experts as S.G. Wheatcroft, Barbara Anderson, and Brian Silver have examined the same census data and have suggested that the numbers Conquest supports are much too high. Additionally, Conquest notes that the famine varied greatly from place to place in the Ukraine. According to post-World War II interviews with Ukrainian émigrés, some places saw little or no food shortage. What regional or local differences could explain this? Were grain quotas arbitrarily set by local officials? Did high levels of peasant resistance or boycott contribute to the famine? We don't know.
So which of these two is the Sovietologically inclined? Unsurprisingly, given the open admission of being a Cold Warrior and propagandist, it's Robert Conquest, the former communist turned clandestine conservative and future Thatcher speechwriter. His reliance on émigré accounts and fixative debate over numbers, along with his clear connection to the emerging neoconservative movement, give us the telltale signs of source, focus, and bias. In the letters, he derides sociology and social history. In response, Getty pulls that little quip about great men theory. That's the alignment here. The revisionists were revising what had been not just a totalitarian framing, but from that, a framing that rejected that anyone but the state and Stalin himself had an impact on Soviet history, an implicit endorsement of great men history. From that, we're able to look briefly at another writer who is, on one hand, not quite a Sovietologist, but certainly a consequence of Sovietology. Simon Sebag Montefiore. What Getty said of conquest about great men, and indeed what he says in another section about writing with flourish, applies just as well to Montefiore. He's what I would call a pop historian, in that most of all the praise I've ever seen him get is for exciting stories and dramatic subjects. His work lends itself well to dinner parties. The subjects tend to be flashy and dramatic or messy and interpersonal. It cannot be said he ignores the individuals behind history, but having read his work, there's what some might call dramatic flair and what I might call embellishment or overemphasis. That said, Montefiore has been able to crack whole new archives, which has been invaluable for other scholars. I'll let a review of his work, Young Stalin, do the talking. It often seems Montefiore accepts uncritically what he finds in his sources, especially if they add juicy tidbits to his well-written narrative. When he does turn to Stalin's life in the revolutionary underground, it is a world of political intrigue and double agents, which served to reinforce Stalin's lifelong paranoia and thirst for revenge. In the epilogue, Montefiore casually suggests Stalin was psychotic. As per usual, the rest will be linked below. Be sure to log into JSTOR, which I'm sure you all know how to do given the last history video. With that done, let's move on to the consequences of Sovietology that go beyond the success of one journalist turned pop historian. If I had to diagnose how Sovietology got put in the direction it went, it's likely due to the kinds of information present. Lacking access to archival sources, and with personal accounts limited to the perspective of expats, refugees, and enemies of the regime, the safest thing appeared to be relying instead on numbers, and then bringing in the personal accounts to flesh out the narratives. And there's a depersonalization that takes hold here. Indirectly leads to reinforcing myths like human wave. Everything is reduced to numbers, bodies, and statistics only to be fleshed out by historical accounts later, irrespective of where they come from, if they're stories told by a soldier facing against an attack, not as part of one. From there, it's easy to fall into othering. The mysterious Soviet lifestyle with its impregnable traditions of participating in international sports competitions, having Christmas, still making music, being a country full of normal people. That's not to downplay the very real role and consequences of the Iron Curtain, but the way some of these people talk about the Soviet Union makes it sound genuinely alien. Needless to say, there's a lot going on with respect to Cold War politics. There's a reason that the specter of bias is so omnipresent in debate. Personally, I find the numbers game to be selectively flawed. As something that rose to prominence in the absence of other information, it itself is often not very informative. Tangential, but to the point, one of my favorite casualty listings on Wikipedia, because apparently I have those, is on the Russian Civil War page, which is a minefield of citation needed. Discussing the Red Terror, the article states, during the Red Terror, estimates of Cheka executions range from 12,733 to 1.7 million, which is, look, irrespective of one's stance on the events, this is an absurd range. Surely we can all agree that give or take 1.68 million people is a sentiment that demands re-examination. My point is that using numbers is tricky because as hard data goes, it's still reliant on sources, on accuracy, on interpretation, and on not being manipulated. There isn't some magical, objective ticking meter out there that we can measure our understanding of history against. And as far as Soviet history is concerned, the lower estimates have generally borne out, enough so that the totalitarian school has withered, though they certainly aren't gone, just reframed, and their ideas and rhetoric have not left the mainstream. Soviet historiography, though evolving on some level past the conditions of Sovietology, is still rife with contentious debates that don't just discuss interpretations of sources. Following from Conquest and Getty, there has been a manner of intensification, and as the years have gone on and the famine has become a foundational cornerstone of nationalist politics, some historians have taken up the Cold War mantle of anti-Soviet history and begun incorporating sources once considered dubious. Journalists turned pop historian like Anne Applebaum have mainstreamed the Sovietological claims and dubious practices and sources. The tendency to see the Soviets as a wholly evil force, to construct a nature of pure malicious intentionality, is ongoing. We, in all things really, but especially here, need to be mindful of the consequences of estimates and what sources are being used. Incidental but similar to the Cheka wiki estimates having a massive range, Hearts of Iron has a moment where it trusts the highest estimate possible for a casualty count right in the starting Turkish national spirits. 1/4 of the population lost to the war is a big citation needed moment, especially when other estimates put the number around 1.5%. It's tricky because of other factors like the population loss that a country experiences when it loses populated territory, and when, in Turkey, 25% is a bit ingrained in some tellings of the formation of the nation, including the Turkish Wars of Independence following the war, and it's a big mess. But even then, 25% is unsubstantiated. My point is that there's a question of which sources make it into the game and what this estimate even includes. Sovietology has use as a term to distinguish the sourced from the unsourced, the dark age of Soviet historical studies from the West, and I mean dark age in its intended way, describing an era that requires more illumination via sources. The historiography of modern Russia has evolved rapidly in the past 60 years with the opening and exploration of archives, with de-Stalinization, with glasnost, with the fall of the regime itself. We are in a post-Sovietological world now, but these accounts are still knocking around. These methods still exist. The statistical approach was canonized, the psychology and almost great man level approach given oversized credence. Hearts of Iron is in an odd place. It both plays into and cannot connect with differing elements of Sovietology. Fundamentally, Hearts of Iron does not care about people, about demographics. It cannot care about the people. And you can see how this both plays into and against Sovietology's approach. Like Sovietology, it has no interest in social conditions and is a game where the only numbers representing people are manpower and casualties. But unlike Sovietology, it's a game lacking demography, lacking a place from which to draw statistics. Further, and earnestly, I can't tell if this leans into or away from the Sovietological approach at this point, Hearts of Iron is incurious about culture and how people lived. Though, to be clear, this setup is inherent to the whole game, not faction-locked. A Sovietologist approach would probably have a casualty counter ticking in the corner measuring implicit deaths and, likely, giving vague attributions, looking to understand the regime by its impact on measurable statistics, not by the quality of life and goings-on of existing within that country. In this way, Hoy tends towards the distanced Sovietologist approach, but again, the non-military population does not exist in Hearts of Iron. In turn, the primary concern of Sovietology, civilians and their captivity, so to speak, is also not represented. And as I said with the famine collectivization thing, it's probably for the best they didn't model civilians and explicit atrocity and all that, but we'll save that discussion for later. Ultimately, there's a link between the two via some implicit and stated assumptions that blend into one another, where the modeling of events takes on a Sovietological tone. So, what, then, is the tone when placed in the context of a game? Would it be fair to call a game Sovietological if it fits the criteria of 1, being about the Soviet Union, and 2, being loose or speculative with sources? The link between Hearts of Iron and Sovietology is strongest at the point of consequence. The game itself is not an act in Sovietology the way I argued Victoria 3 has done historiography. The game is, in part, a result of trusting historians. I can't wholly fault that, because they've done the work. Sovietology just shows that an entire subfield can do the work for decades and still come up with different numbers, accept different sources from each other, or even use the same sources to come to radically different conclusions. The discussions became subsumed by their political context. In the end, Sovietology and its products aren't merely hard to trust because of method, but because of motive. But sometimes we can't be so choosy with our historical representation, and that opens us up to the Dark Age thing again. Do we just forego a telling of history until we think we've got it mostly right? How will we know when we've got it right at all? For a while, and indeed to this day in some ways, we don't know enough about the events and will have to rely on speculations, on extrapolations. Like the questions of knowing the full story of North American colonialism, this may just be a differ end. By nature of an event, record of the event might not exist. We might never have the full story. But that doesn't excuse the take biased estimates at face value, pray to be proven right later approach of men like Robert Conquest, men who turned history from a search search for the truth into an unabashed, self-affirming propaganda weapon. Bad history begets bad history. Unfortunate as it is, history is built on borrowing credibility from others, and if bad history is lent credibility at some stage in the process, then others may borrow that credibility down the line, sometimes leading to chains of abstraction. And from those abstracted sources, we eventually lose the thread on who said what, when, and what the reasoning was. Remember John Glubb and the Empire's last 250 years thing? Remember how a truism constructed by a British colonialist who blamed women for the downfall of the Islamic Golden Age permeated into leftist internet rhetoric? I wouldn't be surprised if someone like Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book in the next 5 years that included the Empire's last 250 years thing from Glubb, and he just presumed that Glubb had done the work. Just as I wouldn't be surprised to see a resurgence of conquest citations following the renewed interest in Ukrainian history in the West. His books don't come with a caveat on the cover saying, "Hi, I'm Robert Conquest, former propagandist and self-professed Cold Warrior." And eventually, things like that trickle their way into history games, either via becoming popular perception or entering into the vague realm of whatever it is studios like Paradox do to find their sources. It's on library shelves. It will get picked up. This one got away from me a bit. It was a challenge to draw the line of when I wanted to save something for next time, and I'm sure I said that phrase like 5 times in the video. The reason is that I want to contain discussion of the famine, of atrocity, not just for algo reasons, but also because my next history video is going to be discussing them, maybe with some help. We'll see. Speaking of help, thanks to the 2 guests of this video. If you're looking for somewhere to go after this or just want someone new on your radar, might I suggest you head over to Armchair Egyptology or Step Back, who voiced Robert Conquest and J.R. Getty respectively. Both of them make good and stylistically distinct history content. Links below to hand-picked videos. I've got the vaguest of plans to do something more lighthearted but still history-driven in the near future, and I'm somewhat committed to losing my mind trying to explain why the Elder Scrolls world is good and bad at world building. If you want to see that stuff, maybe subscribe, in case I actually get around to it. Thanks to everyone who helped finance my descent into madness. Special thanks this time goes to Chandler Mason, Freddy, Galactic Beyond, Mark Soto, Nick, and Non-Suggest. Also, sorry if I missed anyone in the last one. Patreon has been changing some of the ways it functions, and it's kind of made it an organizational mess to keep track of, especially when things aren't really monthly anymore. If you watched this and you hated it, make sure to become a patron so I have more confusing admin to do. Oh, and one final thing. Sincerely, truly, I want to give thanks to everyone who watched this with patience for the fact I'm tapping into a sensitive and politically charged subject with the famines, and I hope that patience continues as I explain myself more in the next video. I know it's perhaps a fool's errand to hope to be allowed the space for nuance on the internet, so I'm grateful to those who gave it. That's all. Bye.